episode 95 of the Real World Wellness Podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Christine Lehman, a certified nutritional therapist and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. I see clients in person and remotely, and you can reach me through my website, again, reversediabetescoach.com, and use the contact form. Please remember while you're listening to the show, advice and information we provide is intended to be helpful and informative, but is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment. I am really pleased to welcome Niki Gratix to the show today to talk about the impact of stress on our hormones during perimenopause. And this is the latest installment in a new series on how to have healthy hormones during perimenopause. And just to refresh your memory, that's the stage before menopause that can last anywhere from a few years to several years. So Niki is a nutritional therapist, award-winning one at that, a bioenergetic practitioner and mind-body expert helping people to optimize energy. In 2005, she co-founded one of the largest mind-body clinics in integrative medicine in the UK, United Kingdom, with patients in 35 countries where she worked as Director of Nutrition until 2010. The clinic specialized in treating chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, and she won the award for astounding practice in 2009 and later published a preliminary study in 2012 on its results that appeared in the British Medical Journal Open. The theoretical basis of the clinic's approach was published in Ken Wilber's Journal of Integral Theory and Practice. In 2015, she hosted the largest ever free online health summit on overcoming fatigue, where she interviewed 29 world leading experts on optimizing energy with over 30,000 attendees. And I will provide the link in the show notes to that Abundant Energy Summit. Niki has also spoken at over 20 online health summits, and she has been a regular writer for a range of health magazines in both the UK and the US, and she is currently the education director at NES Health, a quantum biology health technology company. So I will provide the link to several of these URLs as well as Niki's consultations. So welcome, Niki.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Christine. It's great to be here.
Oh, you're very welcome. And we were talking before we went on the air that you're now living in California, and I'm so jealous.
The weather is just too good to pass up, yes.
Yes. So let's introduce this topic of stress, but I wondered if before we get into that, if you could talk a little bit about the endocrine system and what hormones are most impacted by stress during perimenopause.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to stress, the main mechanism that we are really looking at and kind of observing and where the research is on this stress axis. It's abbreviated as the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So we're looking at those kind of organs that are sort of in the brain that are speaking to the adrenals via signaling from the brain to the adrenal system. And this ties in with also kind of female sex hormones, because we know that the adrenals do also produce and interact with even some of the female sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and so on. So essentially, we've got this cascade of interconnecting organs and signals that essentially means that if the brain is constantly getting stuck in a state of stress, so the pituitary is picking up that there is we're in alarm state, and the sympathetic side of the nervous system is chronically activated. It's going to speak to the adrenals, and the adrenals are going to be constantly pumping out, to begin with, too much cortisol, which is going to cause symptoms like lack of sleep. It's kind of the opposite of the rest, digest, detoxify mode. It's the fight-flight response, and things like digestion are less important when we're in this chronic fight-flight response. And essentially, our adrenals get depleted. And then essentially during the age of the menopause, of the perimenopause, kind of our 40s and so on, how well how much our system has been in this state of chronic stress, this fight flight, both from the past and in the present moment. It's a kind of a cumulative impact. So natural changes that are happening in the perimenopause, like certain female hormone output is reducing. We shouldn't be experiencing that in the West as a troublesome thing. It's not a disease state. It should be something that we can experience, just as a change of life without it having so many bad negative symptoms. And we know that, I know with my own experiences working with a lot of chronic fatigue and fatigue issues, that a lot of women, the menopause can be the trigger of fatigue or some very serious chronic fatigue. And this is often because our system has been in a chronic state of stress, and we're in the fight flight mode, and there's multiple systems that get impacted. So I just, everything affects everything. And I'll just give you a quick example. If we've been in chronic stress for many years and we're still stressed now, our digestive ability, our absorption ability, our digestive enzymes are down-regulated, so we're not getting all the nutrients that we need from our food. And if we're not getting all the nutrients we need, it means we don't have the nutrients we need to produce hormones to regulate metabolism properly. So that's just one example of how, when the body comes to its natural change of it's a change of lifetime, it can be, in a way, it can be experienced as another stressor, and then we end up experiencing bad symptoms. The same with pregnancy. If we're not in a strong, robust state, we suffer more during natural processes going on in the body. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. It reminded me of this phrase that I had used when I created my first website. I called it Nourishing Foundations for a reason, which was that you have to establish the foundation of good health in order to support those times of stress. So I think it's a similar concept, right? That you want to have a good foundation for your body to then weather, if you will, the sort of storm of of these stressors, that are hormonal stressors in particular during perimenopause.
Yes, great. And I think that a lot of people, well, and we can break this down and get into it, but I think with most women, they won't actually realise that most people don't have a strong foundation for dealing with the stress that comes when we're in our 40s. And we'll talk about that. We talk about the impact of adverse childhood events, for example, and the number of people who are impacted on that, and how the body resets itself even from childhood, from issues that have happened in childhood, and it resets our entire system to have a increased stress response to all stresses, especially psychological stresses. So if we've had, stressful events in childhood, our system gets reset, and then normal, adult stresses that are inevitable that come, whether that is a hormonal stress, or it's a change of job, or it's a divorce, or things that are going to be inevitable that happen in adulthood, they knock us back more than if we had not, had a kind of a more robust supportive environment. And so when we talk about stress, perhaps we'll get into that more, break down what we mean by stress, because
Right.
it can. Should we do that?
Yes, I think this is a good time to unpack it.
Okay, great. So stress, the body doesn't differentiate between chemical stresses that would include, metabolism, changes in hormones, toxins, chemicals, all of these kind of things, like physical stresses. The body doesn't differentiate between those. And actually, interestingly, electrical stresses are also just as toxic and stressful to the system. And actually, you can even include things like cell phone radiation, EMF and Wi-Fi, and that also is perceived by the body as a stress. And the other huge section of what is described as stress is emotional stress, psychological stress. And so it's interesting, the body does not differentiate. The limbic system of the brain, where the processing center is, that kind of speaks via the amygdala to this hypothalamic pituitary system that eventually speaks to the adrenals, that part of the brain is not differentiating between chemical, electrical, viral, even, microbial, or psychological stresses.
Right.
So any of those stresses will trigger that whole cascading system to switch that system into a chronic fight-flight response, which is basically a breakdown response. It's a fight-flight is not a nourishing, building, rebuilding, replenishing state to be in. I call it the stress state, versus the healing state, which is when we're in a balanced, calm state. And I call that the rest, digest, detoxify. So it's when we can sleep properly and we're rejuvenating and so on. But so any of those things, those kind of I call them loads on the boat, if you like, excess chemical, electrical, microbial, or psychological stress can overload the boat, and the boat eventually sinks. And by sinking the boat, we mean that's an expression of symptoms, whatever that may be, that somebody's experiencing. So it can be a lot of menopause symptoms for when that change of life comes, or it could be, an expression of fatigue or lack of sleep, or another kind of chronic complex illness. So when we say stress, it's any of those things that the body and the heart even is also picking up on, and is taking a signal of we need a stress response. And the stress response is that fight, flight, and we're going to a stress state, which is the opposite of a healing state. And it's okay. On short-term hits is okay. It's normal. Sometimes we need fight, flight. It's when it becomes chronic, and that's when we're in a kind of state of chronic stress, and it's a hugely depleting impact on our body, and it's priming the body for illness and symptoms.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important concept to delineate between acute stress and chronic stress.
Yes, there's a huge difference. So, acute stress could be where, you might actually be in a dangerous situation where you need that fight-flight response. Unfortunately, most of us aren't. We might be missing a train.
Right.
It's usually that fight-flight response to something that we shouldn't really have a stress response to. But, if we were in genuine danger, we need the fight-flight to give us the energy we need to run from the saber-toothed tiger. It's this, it's from evolutionary biology,
exactly.
This idea that, we need to have that to be able to get away, and that's where this response came from. The issue is obviously with modern day living that we tend to get stuck in this state of stress, and there's no release for it. It seems to be our daily lives can be chronically stressful, but whether that's because we have job stress, family stress, even just traffic stress and having to deal with that every day, that's some of where the stress is coming from. But if you like, in many ways, the modern day saber-toothed tiger, the biggest source of stress, or one of the biggest sources of stress, is actually unresolved trauma from childhood. And we can talk about that, the adverse childhood event studies where 17,500 adults were assessed for trauma in childhood. This is by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they found that 67% of all adults have had emotional trauma in childhood, and that was an underestimate. And the researchers came out and said we weren't expecting those results when we did this study in the mid-1990s, and we were only asking for 10 different categories, and we missed many because we weren't expecting the results that we had. And they were looking at things in childhood like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, could be incarceration by a family member, parents separating or divorce, domestic violence, mental illness in the family, or substance abuse.
Right.
Now, so those were the big 10. They missed off things like being a victim of bullying, maybe there was financial crisis in childhood, maybe you witnessed violence. A very traumatic experience is of being hospitalised as a child for some kind of physical illness early. It can be very traumatising for a child.
Right. Go ahead, finish your point.
Well, just to say that this is a vastly underestimated impact or source of stress. At the time that it happens, our bodies change, our system resets. And one of the things that how they started to discover this is they correlated, okay, how many, these adverse childhood events, those 10 that I mentioned, they call them ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And essentially, if you had lots of ACEs as a child, in this study that's originally was 17,500 people, you had a dramatically increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. If you have 6 ACEs, you have a 20-year reduction in lifespan. If you have just 4 ACEs, you have a 400% increased risk of things like Alzheimer's, like depression and dementia.
Right. I think that's a good segue into the symptoms of perimenopause. And for example, depression is a symptom as well. So this is a chicken and the egg issue. You have these risk factors that these people are coming into perimenopause with, correct? So they already have a higher baseline of stress and their response to stress. They're, you might say, at a heightened state of stress already. So then what I want to know is, since the focus here is on perimenopause, how does that affect these people? You know, when they're going through all these hormonal changes, I would think, you know, they're obviously at increased vulnerability for the stresses of perimenopause. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, so you see, and also I'd say fatigue comes into that big time as well, doesn't it? So the point of sharing that data, that general data, is that it's the mass, like most people have got some degree of adverse childhood events that have happened that have reset their system to have an excess response to stresses in adulthood. Mm-hmm. So their system has already got reset. And that would mean that, yes, a trigger like menopause will actually trigger all that, you know, these different types of symptoms. So, for example, as well, if you had ACEs in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of fatigue. And a lot of people with fatigue, the trigger for that is menopause. So the point being, if you're in the menopause now, or you're perimenopausal, and you know that you've got like symptoms that, and you either want to prevent it from being so bad, or you want to be able to help reverse maybe symptoms you're already experiencing, you may want to have a look at what was your childhood like, and was there emotional stress in childhood that could have reset your system such that and you know you've been living with this for many years. And usually when you speak to people, it won't have just been the menopause. There are other symptoms and experiences that they'd had that kind of indicated their system, they were overstressed. And have been for many years. And when somebody has a kind of is dealing with symptoms now in their life, my point is to actually consider, is there some impact? And the thing is that's important is, it's not just what the research, when all that data was looked at and they found this correlation, they started to say, well, what's happening? I mean, how is, you know, childhood biography becoming adult biology? And part of it was what I keep mentioning, which is this reset. So the change in the glucocorticoid expression changes when you've had trauma in childhood, and it's reset for life unless you have an intervention. And now any trigger in adulthood, you're going to be more likely to have a less robust response. So we've had a loss of resilience. So that was one way. Right. Another way that it translates, and this is huge, it's to do with you could always call it the kind of addictive behavior and addictive behaviors especially. So if we've had trauma, we're in a state of emotional pain, and we often will try and do things to reduce the pain.
Sure.
So one of the things that happens is, like, you may know that you need to follow a certain diet, for example, that you know would be really good for you and healthy and would reduce any menopausal symptoms, but you find it really hard to do because maybe you have a sugar addiction, or maybe you're doing emotional eating and things like this. So a lot of that comes back to, it's to do with compliance on things we know we should be doing. I mean, who doesn't know that vegetables and fruit are kind of, these days, that those are the things that are the more healthy types of things? I mean, most people know the basics and still don't do it. And a lot of that is to do with emotional-based eating and the emotional aspect that's playing into this overall picture. And so, for example, just to give you an extreme example, people with lots of ACEs have, you're 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic if you have ACEs in childhood. Only 4 ACEs, you've got a 7-fold increased risk of drinking, becoming an alcoholic. You're 11 times more likely to be using injection drugs. You're over 3 times as likely to be engaging in risky sexual behaviour. But it's the more subtle influences, things like becoming an overgiver, an overachiever, and perfectionist. So overgivers are where we learn to get love from others by giving to others because we didn't get it as a child. So we learn to earn that. So we end up not putting our needs and our best interests at heart, and constantly discounting our own needs and putting other people's needs first. Now this is getting into kind of core, most identity level stuff, but it's number one reason why people have a rough time, like end up with fatigue or fibromyalgia or pain, or have a rough menopause. It's not just because of just pure diet, like educational things about what we need to do on the physical level. It's what's the psychology of the person, what's the subjective state of the person, and we need to think about, when we're looking at somebody, we need to look at the whole picture. So it's not just what you're doing, diet, exercise, these lifestyle factors that we know that could mitigate stresses, the physical and the electrical stresses. You could do a home chemical cleanup. You could clean up your diet and go organic. You could reduce all the physical and chemical stresses.
Right. And
but whether or not
yoga.
you're going to comply with all that, and whether you're really going to do it, is also addressing the psychology side as well, and learning to, it's actually to do with self-love. It comes down to a lot of self-love and learning how to know who you are subjectively, as well as understanding what's going on in your objective environment, if that makes sense.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense. So I guess we're addressing right now the people with more childhood trauma and childhood stressors, but let's talk for a minute, and then we can revisit that. Let's talk for a minute, though, with the people who haven't had all this childhood stuff going on. I mean, or less serious stuff. Everybody has something, right? But it's, let's just give it as a framework, someone who's had a fairly normal, quote unquote, childhood. So they're coming into perimenopause, and they're still going to, they can still experience some of the standard symptoms, right? Like hot flashes, fatigue, irritability, and so on, just by virtue more of the hormonal changes. So, there's sort of that camp, and then there's sort of the camp that you're talking about. So how, maybe you can just briefly talk about, the stress of the hormones themselves. So you're going to undergo these physical changes in your body, but that also can trigger some mental, emotional changes as well, which the impact is going to be, presumably worse for somebody who has not resolved their childhood stress issues. I understand, but I wonder if you could just address that side of it.
Well, it's a cyclical. It's a virtuous or a vicious cycle. It's not a virtuous cycle. It's a vicious cycle. So when our hormones change, that is going to compound. If we already had a pre-existing propensity due to depression or stress or anxiety or chronic anxiety, for example, or things like digestive issues and so on. If we already had a propensity to that, and then we have the hormonal changes as well, that will enhance it, and those biological changes in turn will compound what may have already been existing as well. And then the brain picks up on that message, and there's more now endogenous, the internal changes, the hormonal changes that have happened, and now that the brain is getting a message of internal toxicity, stress coming from the physical body, the whole kind of system's not working as efficiently. So we have this internal buildup of stress from toxins and so on now. And when that happens, even increased free radical levels, we're not detoxifying properly. Then the head is the mind is getting, the amygdala is picking up on more stress, and then it's having a stress response to all the stressors. So this is where we get into this vicious cycle, and an issue becomes chronic rather than just a short-term thing. So we have this cycle, this vicious cycle, which we ideally would need to break. But we'll often find when we try and break that, yes, we want the sort of the biochemical approach, and we should be doing that, and we should be talking, we can talk about some of those types of interventions. But then we also need to just take into account and consider what's going on psychologically as well, because I have to say, in terms of emotional trauma, especially from childhood, the conclusion is from the researchers is probably no one's unaffected, because trauma is also intergenerationally inherited as well. So if you look back on your own childhood and see there's no sort of ACEs that you can think of, and then you need to look at the intergenerational impact. And then in addition to that, there's also what we call silent ACEs, which is it's kind of a trauma which is not obvious. It's not where you've got physical bruises or some physical thing happened. If you speak to the world-leading experts on trauma, like Bessel van der Kolk, who's the professor of psychiatry at the University of Medicine, he'll tell you that the majority of trauma in childhood is to do with attachment issues. It's relational trauma. It's not a specific, discrete incident where PTSD arises. It's actually to do with more regulatory issues to do with people who end up with things like anxiety, depression, addictive behaviours, whether that's subtle addiction to behaviours like workaholism, perfectionism, and so on, or the more, overt gross behaviours, sort of physical behaviours like, overusing alcohol and things like that. So, and also, the relational trauma in childhood usually leads to attachment trauma in adulthood, and we sort of, I think most people go through a difficult time in menopause. When you look at their whole life, there's just about everything in their life, there's other factors playing into it. So, they might be going through a difficult experience with divorce, or they've got a difficult relationship with a child, or they've got troublesome stuff happening in job. And often who we are and the messages we've got as children, so much of that, the social impact of how our relations were in childhood, is also impacting who we are in adulthood. And to be honest with you, you cannot not look at this. I'll give you just one other example of why. There was a gigantic study done. It was, I believe it was 2014, looking at the social impact on health of social relations. And they were looking at over 300,000 people. And they were looking at factors that were determinants of survival. And they found that conflictual relations and your relationships with other people was a greater predictor of survival than your BMI, how much you drank, whether you were diabetic or not, what your diet was like, how much you exercised, and whether you smoked 15 cigarettes a day or not. Now, early childhood trauma studies show that 50% of all adults don't properly attach with their parents. So you're looking now, when you come to your sort of 40s, it's a bit of a time of, oh my goodness, okay, things come home to roost. And, kind of the cumulative stress and difficulty you've been through in adulthood, you've been given a template from childhood, and how well you navigate through that, and the stresses you're dealing with in your adult life, and how robustly you're going to deal with that, is so interconnected with social relations that you've got going on, your own internal stress response, and whether it's already been reset as a child. Whether that was your relational trauma, whether it was physical discrete incidents, whether it could have been unreported sexual abuse or physical, and so on. So, if you are dealing with menopause, what's going on with the hormones, that is downstream, and it's just one small part of what's happening, and you need to look at the whole picture. I'm not throwing out what we do on the biochemistry, that's important, so we do need to sort of look at the physical side, and we can do things on the diet and hormonal stuff, but I would say at least 50% of anything that's going on with anybody with symptoms that's having difficulty in this age, you need to start looking at what's the subjective state of your patient. That's if I'm talking to a practitioner, or if you're a consumer, you need to be considering, who are you in the world? What are the stresses in your life right now? How much of that has come from the templates that you were given? And have you got some unresolved stuff to also work through emotionally as well? Because there's an emotional component to every single illness in adulthood.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the strategies that you found effective? And is this something, again, during that you've been addressing in I know you were very active in this mind-body clinic in the UK. Was this something that, can you share maybe some case examples and strategies?
Well, yeah, and some of the steps that people can take to start to consider this psychology side, as well as assessing for the biochemical side as well. In terms of the psychology side, if you haven't heard about the impact of stress, or hadn't really considered that, kind of you were thinking about it quite reductionistically, just thinking like, maybe I could just take some herbs which will help balance my hormones, like Agnus castus and things like this. I'd recommend to widen your perspective on what may be going on in your body, and consider the social and emotional impact of stress. And one of the things you can do to start with, very straightforward, is start with doing an ACE score. So you could start with a very basic ACE score that the original researchers used. You can tot it up. The original researchers' questionnaire is out there. I have a completely free, no opt-in required questionnaire that you can assess on my website, which is nikigratrix.com ACE score. Just go to the homepage, look at the tab at the top, and you'll see it says ACE score, and literally you can just start going through that, and go through and go, okay, let's just start to consider this. I have an extended ACE score on there, including the types of traumas that happen that aren't weren't in the original questionnaire by the researchers because they missed it off. And then I go into attachment trauma, which is really hard to just self-report. They vastly underestimated, for example, emotional neglect as a child, and these kind of more subtle addictive behaviours that we get stuck in because of the sort of changes that happened earlier on in life. So you can go and have a look at the attachment questionnaire as well, which digs deeper, because normally people with emotional trauma, especially emotional neglect, you ask them, did you have emotional trauma in childhood or emotional neglect? And 90% of people will say no, because how would somebody know, and how can they self-report? And you need to dig deeper. So that's all in there as well. And then start exploring, and even connecting with your own parents and ask what their childhood was like and what kind of emotional stresses were going on for them. And have a look, and also start to journaling is proven therapeutically and scientifically. Writing is scientifically proven to be therapeutic. So you can start writing about some of the experiences. Did something happen, and do you remember feeling different as a child, or all the way up to age 18? By the way, is considered childhood still. Was anybody around to talk to about it at the time? Did you change behaviours after certain incidents that happened? For example, did you become like a workaholic, or did you change your behaviour in some way to cope with what was happening? Did you notice physical changes happening from that time onwards? There's also a system called the Enneagram system, which is a personality typing system. Fantastic way of working out, like, what's your psychological propensities. Do you have a tendency not to look after yourself enough, or do you always put work before everything? The majority of women that I see all the time, whether they're dealing with menopausal symptoms, chronic fatigue, most of my caseload is actually, it is mostly women, and it is women between the age of about 25 up to 60. And just about every single person that I'm working with, if you don't ask the questions about what's going on in psychology, you don't know that all that's going on is having a profound impact. But just about everybody is, it's vastly playing into how they are behaving now, how they're complying with what they're doing on the nutrition side, whether they're able to do that or not, whether they're taking enough rest time. One of the things that's absolutely in requirement for dealing with stress is we need daily reset rituals. This is really, or daily recharge rituals. So if you want to counter the impact of stress and start reversing it, whether that's stress happening now in your life or it's from the past, start to do, ideally it should be at least 20 minutes twice a day if you can. And reset or recharge rituals are anything that you would do that will set your body into a calm, what we call an internal sense of calm, safe space. So this might be, the big ones are meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, and Qigong. There's a lot of science behind that. They will reset the neural pathways. They have an anti-inflammatory impact on the body, and they will reset a system, if it's done consistently and it's done daily, but it can reset that entire HPA axis that's stuck in a stress response. So you need to be doing those two types of things twice a day. Also, it doesn't have to be those four. It's anything that will put you in a state of safe space and feeling calm and relaxed. So that might also be, it could be dancing, it could be sculpting, it might be something like art that you're into. It's anything that's not competitive, you can't fail at it, other people aren't going to judge you. It's a safe space of connection to yourself, to your emotions, to your feelings, and calmness. It might just be a walk in nature, could be a hot bath, might be a massage. Could be sex, could be positive social relations with healthy people, doing something social. So that's a very important part of the picture. So one is exploring, do the questionnaires, go back, have a look at this. Who are you in the world? Are these tendencies? By the way, the Enneagram personality typing system, I should have just mentioned, EnneagramInstitute.com. That's ENNEAGRAM Institute.com. You can do a little free questionnaire, or you can pay for a questionnaire for like about $15. And it's for those who really want to explore and find out, was there attachment trauma in childhood? Do I have certain tendencies that are actually causing me to be chronically stressed all the time? And everything that I do on the biochemistry is not going to work as well if my body's stuck in a state of chronic stress. And everybody's got some degree of it, because that's what the statistics are really showing. And then you have like modern day stresses thrown in on top of it, your day-to-day stress. So those are explore, do the Enneagram, you can do the personality typing, you can go and look at, do daily reset rituals, do assess what's going on biochemically, go and see your nutritionist, your functional medicine practitioner, and have an assessment of your hormones, your digestive wellness, and do the interventions on that side as well. Important. It's part of how you would reset the whole system and dealing with a holistic approach. I can just briefly in this last moment, it's up to you, Christine, whether you want to just cover this last point, or people can look at it up on my website. It's up to you whether you want to cover it now. But if people want to get professional help, like they realise they've got a lot, you'll be amazed, Christine, how many people, they've got tons of stuff. There's so much. If you don't ask the question, you don't realise who the people are who are coming in to see you, and they're not going to mention it if you're not going to ask it. So I know there'll be people out there who already know they've got stuff. They've got stuff going on. Some of it might be pretty intense, and it might be quite early trauma, and it's fairly serious. And they may have only talked to a few people about it, or not really talked about it to anybody. I've got some tips about professional help and what to do if you need to, if it's been intense, it's early, and you haven't really dealt with it before, I do recommend going to see a professional in those circumstances.
Absolutely. There's a line between, we're trained as holistic practitioners and someone who specializes and is trained, in counseling.
Exactly, and it's also there's so much you can do at home on your own. I've given people plenty of just starting that exploration process, and the daily reset rituals. Those, they don't cost so much, and you can do them at home. But if you find that you just can't do them, or that, like a lot of people, they can't meditate, for example. You'll see people who are so stressed they can't. It actually makes it worse, or they just cannot do that. And if they suspect that there is something that's not being talked about, that and they know that they're having, if you get up in the morning like the house is on fire, or you're having an over stressful response to things going on now, like that you're having an over response to things, and these other daily rituals aren't working, you need to give the daily rituals a good period of time. You think about how long the system's been conditioned to a stress response. Now you're reconditioning that. But if you do that consistently and you've been compliant with it, and yet you're still having the same symptoms and you're still having high stress response, that's probably a time to go and seek professional help. And the good news is, this will perhaps leave people with this, the good news is there's really great help out there. You do need to search around for the right practitioner and the right type of therapy, but there's something called neuroplasticity. The brain can be changed. You can change your neural pathways. You can reverse this impact, and it can be done, whether it's some people do really great with things like emotional freedom technique. That's the EFT work. Some people do great with that. Some people do great with hypnotherapy, going to see a hypnotherapist. There's a process called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and processing. That works really well with for some people. It's a bit just the same as with biochemistry. What works really well for one person won't necessarily work well for another. EMDR and EFT tend to be good for short-term kind of discrete incidents that happened in childhood. So one-off things that happened that you can remember, that you have a memory around, that happened in one go. For more of the what I would call relational ambient trauma, that's sort of just in the background, it's there all the time because a parent or a caregiver didn't know how to express love, and you are experiencing that as emotional neglect as an ongoing thing every day. That's not a single incident. That would be more things like what's coming out top is something called neurofeedback. Need to be. I've got an article on my website about neurofeedback and finding the right practitioners, because that can be quite a little bit of a job to do that. Or going to see an actual attachment therapist, attachment trauma therapist, even just a psychotherapist or a really good counsellor who is very caring, trustworthy, non-judgmental. That can help too. Some talk therapies don't work if somebody's just talking, but you need to be able to get emotional release during. That's the main thing. Is emotions have charge. If you're just talking, you're in your head the whole time. It won't work. It's kind of the Woody Allen thing. Is still seen 6 psychoanalysts, and he's still as neurotic as ever. So you didn't really get into the emotional movement, and that's when you're recovering from kind of unresolved emotions, when you actually feel some release of the emotions and the charge releases. Talking can do that, but some people need to access it more energetically, which means not talking, but more things like EMDR, hypnotherapy, EFT, massage therapy can work for some people as well.
Yes, that can trigger the release as well, right?
So I have a free resource on my website. So just so that people don't feel like we've left them, with so much information and then left them high and dry. There's a free resource on my website, which is the 7 Steps to Healing Emotional Trauma. It's just a free ebook. And you can see that on my homepage. And I go into a lot of detail about the resources, about where to go and find professional help, like with all the websites linking to all the different types of resources, should people feel like they want that additional information.
And I'll include all these links in the show notes. And I just want to add a few things, having had some trauma in my own childhood. These approaches and strategies that you're talking about are not mutually exclusive. So, as Niki, you were talking about the 20 minutes, even start I meditate. I bring meditation into my practice. I do this. I'm a Buddhist, actually. And so one of the things we teach people, just start even with a few minutes. Same thing with yoga. Start with your breath. It doesn't even don't worry if you can't I can barely do 20 minutes sometimes. So don't worry about that. You can start small in your practice. And then, for deeper issues, and I think Niki's resource will help you with that, especially things that have been ongoing for long periods of time. Unfortunately, I lived in an abusive situation for 20 years as a child, so that's a long time. I got myself into therapy in my early 20s, and I started doing some yoga, but that came a bit later. But all these things are good, so a comprehensive approach can really help you in many ways, because while you're working out, understanding what's going on, gaining clarity, because often if you're a heightened state of stress and anxiety, it's hard to put your finger on what exactly is going on. You need someone to kind of unpack and explain to you your situation. But part of the de-stress thing and getting into the parasympathetic mode is really the deep breathing and the yoga and the meditation will all help calm your system down. So all these things kind of work together, don't you think, Niki?
It's really great points. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of starting small, and it is, at the end of the day, it is something that has to be, you have to do it at the end of the day. I know, we're talking about it, but it's the doing and the experiencing of it. Like you said, the breath. Breathing is, you can't really overestimate how important breathing is. Even just sitting, connecting to your breath and doing conscious breathing, it's bringing you into the present moment. It's so simple, and yet it's so easy to miss. It's so easy to just not schedule it in. It's so easy to get distracted and not do it and go and do something else. And that's the kind of the trickiness of it. It's something that's so simple, and yet so many people don't do it, and it doesn't cost anything, and yet it's probably one of the most important things that we could do on a daily basis to reset our body system into this calm state. I've had people who just did psychology work and recovered from serious chronic fatigue. So when you do that, it's incredibly organizing. When you go into a calm state where you're doing breathing, maybe conscious breathing, it has an incredibly organizing impact on the nervous system in a way that and it's a holistic impact. It's resetting the whole brain state, and that's speaking to the heart, and that's speaking to the digestion, because everything's connected. So this is getting into this state of emotional safety and breathing. It can reset your whole day. You can have a completely different day. You would know this, Christine, if you do your meditation. Days that you don't start that way, and days that if you start the day like the house is on fire, the whole day is different, isn't it?
That's right.
And it's such a critical part of a protocol to dealing with any illness or anything that you're dealing with. Menopause definitely included in that. And perimenopausal symptoms, this kind of a daily practice. And of course, the more that you've done that earlier, you'll be more robust, in dealing with the stresses that happen in our 40s. So, but it's never too late to start.
Exactly. Well, thank you. Those are great words of wisdom, and thank you so much for sharing all that on the Real World Wellness podcast today. And listeners, you can find more about Niki and learn about some of the things that we've been talking about on her website, again, nikigratix.com, and I will provide all the links in the show notes. So stay tuned for the next episode. I will have Anne Moline, who is an herbalist as well as a certified nutritionist, and we talked about natural and herbal remedies. So stay tuned for that and have a great, healthy week, everyone.